Welcome to Grim Fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. The mansion on Elm Ridge was more than just an eyesore. It was an open wound in the town's history. Decaying shingles and ivy-covered walls whispered stories of misfortune. Generations of townsfolk had grown up hearing the same warnings. Stay away from that house. It takes people. Emma had heard it all before. A freelance filmmaker specializing in urban exploration, she scoffed at local ghost stories. Fear, she often said, was good for views. When her channel subscribers suggested she explore the mansion, Emma saw the perfect opportunity. Equipped with a flashlight, her trusty camera, and a pinch of bravado, she set off on a warm summer evening to uncover the secrets of Elm Ridge. The gravel road leading up to the house was overgrown, the forest pressing in from both sides like a tunnel. Her boots crunched against the stones, each step louder in the unsettling quiet. No birds sang. Even the cicadas that filled the summer air elsewhere seemed to avoid this place. When the house finally came into view, Emma's breath caught. It was bigger than she'd imagined, its blackened windows like empty eyes staring out over the forest. The front door hung ajar, the paint peeling away in long strips. For a moment, she hesitated. Something in the air felt wrong, thick with an unnameable tension, like the moments before a thunderstorm. She shook off the feeling and flipped on her camera. "All right, guys," she said, her voice confident but a little too loud. "Here it is, the infamous Elm Ridge Mansion. The town says it's haunted, but we're about to find out if that's true. Wish me luck." The first step inside felt like crossing into another world. The air was cooler, stale, and heavy with the scent of mildew. The grand entry hall was covered in dust, its marble floors cracked, and the remnants of an ornate chandelier lay shattered in the corner. Her flashlight beam swept across walls that had once been lavishly wallpapered but were now bare, revealing rotted wood beneath. Emma moved slowly, narrating her steps for the camera. This place must have been stunning once. Look at the size of this staircase. She pointed her camera at the sweeping staircase that ascended into darkness, its banister warped with age. The sound of her voice echoed, but there was something strange about the echo. It felt delayed, as if something else was repeating her words a moment too late. "Hello," she called, her voice faltering slightly. No response. Emma pressed deeper into the house, filming everything. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to stretch just a little too far. She found herself glancing over her shoulder more often than usual. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the unease in her chest was growing. In what must have been the living room, she found remnants of a past life. A piano missing half its keys, an overturned armchair, a stack of yellowed newspapers from the 1950s. She knelt to examine the headlines. "Family disappears in tragedy at Elm Ridge home." She read aloud for the camera. The Harper family, parents and 2 children, vanished without a trace. Police searches yielded no results. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house on the night they disappeared. A loud thud echoed from upstairs, interrupting her. Emma froze. "Probably just the house settling," she whispered, for the words felt like a lie. The sound hadn't been distant or faint. It had been deliberate, almost purposeful. Her hand tightened on the camera. "All right, let's check it out." The stairs groaned under her weight as she climbed, the flashlight beam flickering with every step. Upstairs was darker, the windows here completely boarded up. The air smelled worse, heavy with rot and something metallic. She turned left into a long hallway lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. A soft sound broke the silence like someone whispering, just at the edge of hearing. She swung her flashlight toward the noise, illuminating the far end of the hall. Nothing was there, but the whispering continued, growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't words, but something else entirely, a low, breathy sound that sent shivers down her spine. She stepped closer to the source of the noise, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. The last door in the hallway was closed, its brass knob gleaming faintly. The whispering was definitely coming from behind it now. Her hand hovered over the knob. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave, to run. But her camera was rolling, and she had an audience to impress. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room beyond was drenched in red light, its source unclear. The walls were covered in writing, chaotic scribbles that overlapped and bled into each other. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she realized the writing wasn't random, it was names. Hundreds of them, thousands. And then she saw it. Her own name, written in bold letters, smeared as though by a trembling hand. Behind her, the whispering stopped. In the oppressive silence that followed, Emma heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving toward her from the hallway. The door slammed shut behind her. Emma stood frozen in the crimson room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The sudden silence pressed against her ears like a heavy weight, amplifying the sound of her own shallow breathing. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of what had slammed the door. It was empty, but the air was different, now thicker, heavier, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. Her camera, still rolling, caught movements her naked eye couldn't perceive. In the playback screen, faint shapes flickered in the corners of the room, humanoid but distorted, their outlines blurring as if they were caught between worlds. Emma didn't notice this yet. Her focus was on the walls. The names stretched endlessly across the blood-red surfaces, each written in shaky, desperate scrawls. Some were crossed out violently, others were smeared as though written by fingers dipped in something wet. Her own name was still there, clear as day, circled in a jagged oval. She reached out to touch it, but her fingers stopped just short of the wall. The surface wasn't smooth, it pulsed, subtly, as though it was breathing. Her stomach churned. This isn't possible," she whispered, the words barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The whispering returned, louder this time, a disjointed chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It wasn't in a language she could understand. The sounds were guttural, inhuman, but they carried a weight of malice that made her skin crawl. Her camera screen flickered. For a brief moment, the room wasn't empty. The flickering shapes became more distinct, tall, elongated figures with limbs too long, heads tilting unnaturally as they stared at her. Their eyes, or the hollow spaces where eyes should have been, glowed faintly with an unnatural light. Emma stumbled back, bumping into the center of the room. Her flashlight beam swung wildly, casting jagged shadows across the walls. The figures in the camera weren't visible in the beam, but their presence was undeniable. She felt them, an oppressive weight closing in on her, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. "What do you want?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The whispering stopped again, as suddenly as it had started. The silence that followed was worse. It felt alive, pressing against her, suffocating her. She tried to move toward the door, but her legs felt heavy, as if the air itself was pulling her back. A single word broke the silence. A voice, low and gravelly, whispered her name. "Emma." She whipped around, shining her flashlight wildly. The room was empty, but her name echoed, bouncing off the walls in that same delayed, unnatural way. She clutched her camera like a lifeline and stepped toward the door, her heart pounding in her ears. The door didn't budge. She twisted the knob harder, panic rising in her chest. "No, no, no, come on!" she hissed, slamming her shoulder against the wood. It didn't move. Behind her, a shadow stretched across the floor, long and twisting. It moved independently of the flashlight beam, slithering toward her like a living thing. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned her head. At the far end of the room, the shadow had taken form. It was tall and skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its face, or what should have been a face, was blank, featureless, save for two deep hollows where eyes should have been. From those hollows, faint tendrils of light leaked out, writhing like smoke in the air. Emma took a step back, her legs trembling. The figure didn't move, but its presence was unbearable. It exuded a cold, crushing dread that made her want to scream and cry at the same time. "Stay back," she whispered, raising her flashlight like a weapon. The beam passed through the figure without effect, as though it wasn't really there, but it was. She could feel it. The figure tilted its head further, the motion unnatural, accompanied by a sickening crack. Then it took a step forward. The sound of its movement wasn't that of footsteps, but a low, wet, dragging noise, like flesh being pulled across stone. Emma stumbled back until her spine hit the door. "Stay away," she screamed. The figure stopped, its head snapping upright. Its hollow eyes seemed to widen, and its entire form shuddered, as if laughing silently. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers but carried her tone, it spoke again. "Emma." Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything, but her body refused to obey. The shadow took another step, and as it moved, the walls of the room seemed to warp. The red glow intensified, the names on the walls blurring together until they looked like rivers of blood, flowing and merging. Suddenly, the door behind her gave way. Emma fell backward into the hallway, landing hard on the dusty wooden floor. She scrambled to her feet and swung her flashlight back toward the room, but the door had slammed shut again, as though it had never opened. The whispering followed her into the hall. Louder now, more urgent. She didn't wait to find out what would happen next. Clutching her camera, she bolted down the hallway, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind her, she heard the sound of doors opening one after another, each accompanied by that same low, dragging noise. She didn't dare look back. She ran until her legs ached, until the sound of her own ragged breathing drowned out everything else. When she finally stopped, she was back in the entry hall. The front door was just ahead, still ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling in. Relief washed over her, and she sprinted toward it. But as she reached for the handle, the door slammed shut in her face, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. The whispering surrounded her again, louder than ever. This time it was laughing. Emma spun around, her back pressed against the sealed front door. The laughter in the whispers was maddening, a chorus of disjointed voices rising and falling like a twisted symphony. Her flashlight darted across the entry hall, illuminating decayed furniture, splintered beams, and walls alive with crawling shadows. The house itself seemed to pulse, a living entity exhaling its dark presence around her. She gripped her camera, its red recording light steady, and whispered to herself, "I have to get out. Focus, Emma. Focus." The whispers faded suddenly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The change was so abrupt it made her ears ring. The quiet pressed against her, a palpable force, and she knew the house was watching her. Her flashlight dimmed. "No," she breathed, shaking it desperately. The beam flickered, then stabilized, though weaker than before. As it did, her eyes caught something that made her stomach drop. The hallway leading to the second floor had changed. It was no longer empty. At its center, a single door stood ajar, glowing faintly red. Her breath hitched. It was the same door she'd fled from moments ago. But that was impossible. She was in the entry hall now. The geography of the house was shifting, bending to some sinister will. Emma felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. The whispers returned, softer this time, coaxing, laced with malice. They seemed to come from the red-lit doorway, calling her back. Her instincts screamed to stay away, but curiosity tugged at her. She was an explorer, an investigator of forgotten places and unsolved mysteries. She had to know what was inside that room, and deep down she suspected the house wouldn't let her leave until she found out. Her legs felt heavy as she approached the door. Each step echoed too loudly, the sound ricocheting unnaturally down the hall. The door creaked wider as she neared, as though inviting her in. She crossed the threshold and immediately felt the change. The air inside the room was dense and suffocating, charged with a static energy that raised the hairs on her arms. The red light bathed everything in an eerie, otherworldly glow. Her flashlight flickered again, but it wasn't needed here. The room seemed to emit its own light, a pulsing, breathing red that made her feel like she was inside a beating heart. The walls were the first thing she noticed. They were no longer bare. They were alive. Thousands of names covered every inch, written in overlapping layers of crimson ink, or was it blood? Emma's eyes scanned them, her pulse quickening as she recognized some. Her own name, the Harpers. Other missing persons she'd read about online. The room was a catalog of the house's victims. Her gaze landed on the far wall, where something new had appeared. A message, written in bolder, larger strokes than the rest. Time to join. Emma stepped back instinctively, her heel catching on the rotting floorboards. No, she muttered, shaking her head. I'm not staying here. I'm not. Her camera beeped. She glanced at the screen, confused. The recording indicator flashed wildly, as though the camera was malfunctioning. Then she saw it. In the playback, the walls weren't just written on. They were moving. The names writhed and twisted, letters stretching into shapes that looked like hands. Faces distorted, screaming faces pressed against the walls, their mouths opening and closing silently. Emma's flashlight beam swayed wildly as she turned in circles, trying to see the room through her own eyes. Nothing moved, but her camera told a different story. No, 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 she stammered, the words tumbling out in a panicked stream. She turned the camera back toward the far wall, focusing on the message. Her name had changed. Now it read, Emma, watch behind you. She froze, a cold shiver running down her spine. Her camera screen flickered again, the distorted playback showing a tall shadow rising behind her. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilting impossibly to one side. Her body refused to turn. Fear rooted her to the spot as the shadow loomed closer, its hollow, glowing eyes fixed on her through the camera. She felt its presence before she heard it, a low, rattling breath that sent chills through her bones. Emma, it whispered, the sound like gravel scraping against steel. Her fight-or-flight instinct finally kicked in. She spun around, raising her flashlight, but the beam passed through empty air. The room was still, silent, as though nothing had been there. Yet the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. Her camera beeped again, louder this time. She glanced at it and her heart stopped. The playback showed her own face, staring directly into the lens. But it wasn't her. The expression was wrong. Her eyes were hollow, glowing faintly like the shadows, and her mouth stretched into a grotesque smile. The camera beeped again. The playback stopped. The room trembled. The walls began to pulse visibly now, the names rippling like waves. The red light grew brighter, harsher, burning into her retinas. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, vibrating in her chest. Time to join. The whispering voices chanted in unison, their tones overlapping into an inhuman cacophony. Emma stumbled toward the door, her vision swimming. Her flashlight dimmed further, its beam now barely more than a flicker. The walls seemed to close in as she moved, the names stretching toward her, their letters forming claw-like shapes. She reached the door just as it slammed shut. Her hands clawed at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out," she screamed, slamming her shoulder against the wood. "Please!" Behind her, the hum grew louder. A shadow loomed over her, stretching across the door like a dark stain. She felt it cold, heavy, suffocating, leaning closer. The voice whispered in her ear, soft but unmistakable, "You were always meant to be here." The door flew open without warning, sending her sprawling into the hallway. She turned back toward the red room, but the door was gone. The wall was smooth, unbroken, as though the room had never existed. Emma sat there, trembling, the whispers fading into silence once more. Her flashlight gave out completely, plunging her into darkness. Only her camera's dim red recording light remained, casting an eerie glow on her pale, terrified face. Somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked open, and the whispers started again. Emma sat on the floor of the dark hallway, her breath hitching in short, panicked bursts. The house was alive, changing, shifting, and playing with her like a predator toying with its prey. Her flashlight was dead, and the camera's faint red recording light was the only source of illumination. Every nerve in her body screamed for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The house wouldn't let her leave. The sound of distant creaking drew her attention. At first, it was faint, like the groan of old wood, but it grew louder with every passing second. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere. Emma clenched her fists, her palms damp with sweat, and forced herself to stand. As she turned a corner, the dining hall emerged from the darkness, bathed in the same faint red glow she had seen in the room of names. Her first instinct was to avoid it, to turn back and find another way, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her forward as if compelled by some unseen force. The room was larger than it had seemed from the outside. A long dining table stretched almost the entire length of the hall, covered in a decaying, moth-eaten cloth. Dusty plates and rusted silverware were set as if a feast had once been laid out. But it wasn't the table that made Emma freeze. It was the figures seated around it. At first she thought they were mannequins or statues, their rigid forms and lifeless postures uncanny in the dim light. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized they were dolls. Dozens of them, each about the size of a small child, sat in chairs that dwarfed their delicate frames. Their porcelain faces were cracked, their eyes painted black. Some had missing limbs, others missing patches of their synthetic hair, but all of them were staring straight ahead, as if waiting for something. Emma's hand instinctively reached for her camera, her thumb brushing against the record button. The small light on the device flickered as she raised it. She panned across the table, documenting the eerie scene. "Okay," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Just a creepy old dining room, nothing's..." A sudden noise cut her off, a faint scraping, like nails dragging across wood. Emma lowered the camera, her heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from the dolls. She took a cautious step closer, her breath shallow. The scraping grew louder, rhythmic, as though something was scratching from within the porcelain figures. Emma's gaze flicked from one doll to the next, her eyes drawn to their black, staring eyes. "Is this a trick?" she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. As if in response, one of the dolls moved. It was a small, almost imperceptible motion, a twitch of its head. But Emma saw it. She gasped and stumbled back, her camera slipping from her hands. The sound of it hitting the floor was deafening in the oppressive silence. The dolls' heads began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, until they were all facing her. Their blank, lifeless eyes seemed to bore into her soul. The scraping stopped, replaced by a low hum that emanated from the table itself. Emma's pulse raced as the hum deepened, vibrating in her chest. She backed away, her foot brushing against her fallen camera. She bent to grab it, but the moment her fingers touched the device, the hum erupted into a cacophony of voices. They weren't human. The voices were high-pitched, broken, like a scratched record being played backward. They filled the room, overlapping, creating a chaotic melody that made her ears ring. Emma clutched her head, dropping the camera again as she tried to block out the sound. But the voices weren't just noise, they were words. Disjointed and fragmented, but unmistakably calling to her. "Join us, stay, you can't leave." "No!" Emma screamed, her voice drowned out by the choir of voices. The dolls began to move in unison. Their stiff arms raised slowly, their fingers clawing at the air, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their jaws dropping open, though no sound came from their mouths. The voices continued, as if coming from the room itself, vibrating in her chest, her skull. Emma turned and bolted for the door, her boots skidding on the dusty floor. But as she reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in her face with a force that rattled the walls. She pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the voices grew louder. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately regretted it. The dolls were no longer seated. They stood now, their movements jerky and unnatural, their cracked porcelain faces expressionless. They advanced toward her, their tiny feet dragging against the wooden floor. Emma threw herself against the door, pounding on it with all her strength. "Let me out!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The voices in the room fell silent. The sudden quiet was more horrifying than the noise. Emma turned again, her back against the door, trembling. The dolls were gone. The table was empty, the chairs vacant. The red glow that had bathed the room had dimmed, leaving it in near total darkness. Her camera, lying forgotten on the floor, beeped faintly. Emma hesitated, then darted forward to grab it. As her fingers closed around it, a cold skeletal hand clamped down on her wrist. She screamed, dropping the camera again as she tried to pull away. A single doll stood before her now, its blank eyes staring up at her. Its mouth, once a painted line, was now a gaping hole, dark and endless. From that hole, a voice whispered, calm and deliberate, "Stay." Emma wrenched her arm free and stumbled back. The doll collapsed, lifeless once more. The room shook violently, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. A door on the far side of the room creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that hadn't been there before. She didn't hesitate. Clutching her camera, she sprinted toward the new exit, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out everything else. As she entered the corridor, the door slammed shut behind her, leaving her in total darkness once again. The whispering followed. The corridor was suffocatingly dark. The only sound Emma could hear was the faint static hum of her camera. Her flashlight had long since died, leaving her completely dependent on the weak red recording light of the camera. It wasn't much, but it gave her just enough visibility to make out the faint outlines of the walls pressing in on either side of her. Her breaths came in shallow gasps. Every step she took felt like walking into the mouth of something alive, something watching her, waiting for her to falter. The corridor stretched endlessly, its walls narrowing slightly with every step she took. Her shoes scuffed against the uneven wooden floor, the faint echoes mocking her with their eerie, distorted delay. Emma's fingers brushed against the wall to steady herself, but the texture wasn't wood. It felt damp, almost fleshy. She pulled her hand back with a shudder, clutching her camera tighter. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Keep moving and you'll find a way out." She wasn't sure she believed her own words, but the alternative to stop, to wait for whatever was following her, was unthinkable. The corridor finally ended in a small room, barely larger than a closet. It was empty save for a tall, ornate mirror propped against the far wall. Its frame was gilded, intricately carved with vines and strange symbols that seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light of her camera. Emma hesitated. Something about the mirror felt wrong, its presence too deliberate, too calculated. It was the only object in the room, its reflective surface gleaming like an open wound in the darkness. "Okay, just a mirror," she muttered, trying to steady her nerves. "Just another creepy antique." She inched closer, the camera raised to capture every detail. As she approached, her reflection came into view, or what she thought was her reflection. At first glance, it looked like her. Same clothes, same hair, same terrified expression. But as she stared, the differences became clear. Her reflection didn't move when she did. It stood perfectly still, its eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her stomach churn. Emma lifted a trembling hand to her face. Her reflection didn't mimic her movement. Instead, it smiled. The smile wasn't hers. It was too wide, too sharp, the edges of its mouth stretching unnaturally across its face. Emma stumbled back, her camera shaking in her hands. The reflection stepped forward, closing the gap between them, though Emma hadn't moved. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Her reflection tilted its head, as though amused. Then, in a voice that sounded like hers but distorted, it whispered, "You're already mine." Emma's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, the camera clattering beside her. She crawled backward, desperate to put distance between herself and the mirror. But the reflection didn't stay confined to the glass. It began to press forward, its surface rippling like water. "No!" Emma screamed, scrambling to her feet. She grabbed her camera and bolted for the door she'd entered through, but it was gone. The room had no exit now, just 4 smooth walls and a mirror. She turned back toward the mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection had fully stepped out of the glass, its movements jerky, as if it was learning how to move its borrowed body. It stood there, grinning, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. Emma backed into a corner, clutching her camera like a shield. "Stay away!" she shouted, her voice breaking. The reflection took a step toward her, then another. With each movement, its grin grew wider, its features more distorted. Its head tilted to one side, then the other, with a sickening crack. As it loomed over her, it spoke again, its voice now a blend of hers and something far darker. "You can't run. You're already part of me." Emma squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the end, but nothing came. When she dared to open them, the reflection was gone. The mirror was back to normal, its surface smooth and still. She didn't trust it. Her instincts screamed at her to smash it, to destroy it, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. This wasn't just a mirror. It was something far older, far more dangerous. Emma turned her camera toward the mirror, recording its unmoving surface. But when she looked at the playback screen, her blood ran cold. Her reflection was still there. It stared at her through the camera's lens, smiling that same inhuman smile. And as Emma watched, it raised a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass, as though trapped behind a thin barrier. The whispering returned, faint at first but growing louder. The reflection's lips moved, forming words Emma couldn't hear. She lowered the camera slowly, her eyes locking with the figure in the mirror. This time it wasn't smiling. It slammed its hands against the glass, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. Cracks spread across the mirror's surface, spider webbing outward. Emma stumbled back, shielding her face as the glass shattered, shards flying in every direction. When the noise subsided, she opened her eyes. The mirror was gone. In its place was another corridor, identical to the one she had entered from. The whispers surrounded her now, angry and relentless. They weren't coming from the walls anymore. They were inside her head. Emma staggered forward, clutching her camera like a lifeline. She didn't know where she was going, or if she would ever find a way out. But one thing was certain, the house wasn't finished with her yet. Emma emerged from the corridor into a cavernous room, her steps echoing as though the house itself was amplifying the sound. The air here was colder, damp and heavy with the stench of mildew and earth. Her camera, still clutched tightly in her hands, cast a faint red light that barely illuminated the vast space ahead. Somewhere in the darkness, water dripped in steady intervals, the sound like a ticking clock counting down. She scanned her surroundings, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The room was empty, save for a spiral staircase descending into what could only be the basement. The staircase was rusted and fragile-looking, its steps narrow and treacherous. "No," Emma whispered to herself, her voice trembling, "not the basement." But the house seemed to leave her no choice. The whispers had quieted, but she felt them pressing in on her mind, urging her downward. It wasn't the same chaotic chorus from before. This was something else, something singular, something patient. The staircase groaned under her weight as she descended, each step sending vibrations through the structure. The light from her camera barely reached the walls, and she was acutely aware of the oppressive darkness pressing in from every direction. The air grew colder with each step, the dampness soaking through her clothes. Her hands clung to the rusted railing, which left flakes of iron on her fingers. As she neared the bottom, the faint sound of movement reached her ears, a soft, wet shuffling sound that made her stomach twist. She paused, her foot hovering above the last step, and strained to listen. The sound stopped. She descended the final step, her boots landing on a dirt floor. The basement stretched out before her, an impossibly large space that seemed to defy the house's exterior dimensions. Wooden support beams dotted the area, many of them cracked and leaning at precarious angles. Her flashlight flickered back to life for a moment, and in its glow, she caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. The walls were covered in claw marks, deep gouges that ran from floor to ceiling. Some of the scratches overlapped, as though whatever had made them had been trapped here for a long time. "Is anyone down here?" Emma called out, her voice shaky. She didn't really want an answer. The flashlight flickered again, then died completely. Her camera's red recording light was all she had now, and it barely pierced the shadows. Something moved. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling sound, like fabric dragging across dirt. Emma spun around, the camera shaking in her hands as she tried to find the source of the noise. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The sound came again, closer this time. Emma backed away, her footsteps crunching on the dirt floor. Her camera's dim light caught movement in the corner of the room. A shadow. No shadows. Plural. They were human-shaped but wrong. Their proportions were distorted, their limbs too long, their heads misshapen. They moved in jerky, unnatural bursts like marionettes controlled by a drunken puppeteer. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a cyclone. Words overlapped, voices clashing as they called her name. "Emma, come to us." She turned and ran, her panic overriding any sense of direction. The dirt floor turned uneven, her boots slipping on loose patches. The whispers followed her, growing louder with every step. She glanced over her shoulder and saw the shadows pursuing her, their movements impossibly fast. Her foot caught on something, and she fell hard, the camera slipping from her grasp and skidding across the floor. She scrambled to her knees, her hands sinking into the cold, damp dirt. Beneath her fingertips, something moved soft, writhing. She yanked her hand back, realizing with horror that the ground was teeming with worms, their pale bodies wriggling in the faint light. The camera's recording light illuminated the pit ahead of her. It was massive, a yawning chasm in the center of the basement. The edges of the pit were lined with bones, human bones. Skulls stared up at her, their empty sockets filled with shadows. The pit itself was impossibly deep, its depths obscured by darkness, but something down there was breathing. A low, guttural sound rose from the pit, a deep inhalation that made the walls of the basement tremble. Emma froze, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like her body no longer belonged to her. The whisper stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, from the depths of the pit, a voice spoke. It wasn't like the whispers, it was clearer, more focused, and it spoke directly to her. "You've come at last." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She tried to speak, but no sound came out. The voice continued, its tone dripping with malice. "You've seen my house, walked my halls, now you will serve." The shadows closed in behind her, their movements growing more frantic, more erratic. Emma turned to face them, her back to the pit, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of the breathing. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not staying. You can't keep me here." The voice laughed, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You were never meant to leave." The ground beneath her feet gave way. Emma screamed as she fell backward, into the pit, into the darkness. The last thing she saw was the circle of bones at the edge, growing smaller as she plunged into the void. Her camera hit the ground beside her, the red recording light still blinking, casting faint glimmers of light on the walls of the pit. They were covered in more claw marks, stretching endlessly downward. And then she saw them, eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. Hundreds of them staring at her, watching her fall. The breathing grew louder, closer, until it was all she could hear. And then there was nothing. The void was absolute. Emma's scream died in her throat as the darkness swallowed her whole. She wasn't falling anymore. She was floating or suspended, held aloft by something she couldn't see or understand. The air was heavy, almost liquid, pressing against her skin and filling her lungs with a cold, metallic taste. Her camera dangled from its strap around her wrist, its red recording light the only beacon in the oppressive black. It swayed slightly, casting fleeting glimmers on the walls of the pit. The claw marks she had glimpsed earlier were deeper here, gaping wounds in the stone, as if something massive had been trying to claw its way out for centuries. A deep, rhythmic sound pulsed through the air, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It wasn't hers. It came from the depths below her, resonating through her chest and rattling her bones. With every pulse, the darkness seemed to ripple, shifting like a living thing. The voice came again, deep and guttural. reverberating through her skull. You are here finally. Emma's teeth chattered as she tried to speak, her words barely audible over the relentless thrum of the heartbeat. What do you want from me? The darkness parted, revealing a faint, sickly light far below. It illuminated the floor of the pit, an expanse of slick black stone, etched with sprawling symbols that pulsed with the same rhythm as the heartbeat. At the center of the floor stood a figure. The Hollow Man. He was impossibly tall, his body a grotesque mockery of human form. His limbs were unnaturally long and thin, bending at angles that defied logic. His skin was stretched taut over his bones, so pale it seemed translucent, revealing black veins that pulsed in time with the heartbeat. His head tilted to one side, and where his face should have been, there was only a void, a hollow, empty space that seemed to pull at Emma, drawing her closer. You have walked the house, the Hollow Man said, his voice low and resonant, a sound that made Emma's chest ache. You have seen its truths. I don't understand, Emma whispered, tears streaming down her face. What are you? What is this place? The Hollow Man tilted his head further, his hollow face tilting toward her as if studying her. This is the vessel, the heart, the house. I am its keeper. Emma's body trembled. Let me go, please. I didn't mean to. You came willingly, the Hollow Man interrupted, his voice rising like the rumble of an approaching storm. You sought the secrets of the house. Now you are part of it. No! Emma shouted, her voice cracking. I didn't know I didn't. The Hollow Man raised a long, skeletal hand, and Emma's words caught in her throat. She felt her body stiffen, an invisible force pinning her in place. The camera swung limply at her side, its faint red light reflecting off the Hollow Man's pale form. You carry the memories, he said, his tone softer now, almost reverent. The house has chosen you to keep its stories. Emma's head throbbed, images flashing through her mind rooms she had never entered, faces she had never seen, screams she had never heard. They came in rapid succession, overwhelming her senses. She saw the Harper family huddled in the dining hall, their faces frozen in terror as shadows closed in around them. She saw the names in the red room being written, each one carved into the walls by unseen hands. She saw the dolls, their lifeless eyes filled with something ancient and hungry. Stop, she cried, clutching her head. I don't want this. The Hollow Man stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. The air around him shimmered, distorting the symbols on the floor as if reality itself bent in his presence. This is not a choice, he said, his hollow face inches from hers. The house consumes all. You will join the others. Struggled against the invisible force holding her, her muscles straining. No, I won't let you take me. The Hollow Man tilted his head the other way, his void-like face unreadable. Then he reached out, his bony fingers closing around the camera. The red recording light flickered violently as he lifted it, holding it up to his hollow face. Your eyes, he said, are mine now. With a sudden burst of strength, fueled by sheer desperation, Emma wrenched herself free of the force holding her. She lunged forward, grabbing the camera from the Hollow Man's grasp. The second her fingers touched it, a wave of energy surged through her, sending her sprawling to the ground. The symbols on the floor flared to life, their pulsing light intensifying. The Hollow Man let out a guttural roar, his long limbs thrashing as the light consumed him. Emma scrambled backward, clutching the camera to her chest, her vision swimming. The ground beneath her began to crumble, the stone fracturing and falling away into the void below. The Hollow Man's form twisted and contorted, his screams merging with the roar of the collapsing pit. Emma didn't think, she ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted toward the faint outline of a staircase that had appeared in the distance, its rusted metal shimmering in the chaos. The ground cracked and fell away behind her with every step, the void hungrily devouring everything in its path. She reached the stairs and climbed, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. The ascent seemed endless, the red light of the symbols still flashing below her. The Hollow Man's screams echoed in her ears, growing fainter with each step. Finally, she emerged back into the house, The basement door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and the whispers ceased. Emma collapsed onto the floor of the entry hall, gasping for breath. The house was eerily silent now, its oppressive weight lifted. Her camera dangled from her wrist, the recording light still glowing faintly. She didn't feel relief. She felt hollow, like something vital had been taken from her. As she raised the camera to her face, the screen flickered. On it, her reflection stared back. But it wasn't her anymore. It was smiling. The silence in the house was suffocating. A stillness so profound that it pressed against Emma's chest, making it hard to breathe. She sat on the cold floor of the entry hall, clutching the camera to her chest, as though it were the only thing tethering her to reality. Her reflection's twisted smile lingered in her mind, a grotesque mockery of her own face. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. She needed to move. Staying in one place felt like inviting the house to claim her, to pull her back into the depths where the hollow man had waited. The entry hall was dim, its familiar layout unnerving in its sudden quiet. The whispers, the shifting walls, even the unnatural shadows all gone. But something else had replaced them, a faint ticking sound. It was subtle at first, blending into the oppressive silence. But as Emma moved through the hall, it grew louder, more distinct, until it echoed like the pounding of a drum in her ears. She followed the sound, her steps hesitant and deliberate. The camera dangled from its strap, the red light casting a faint glow that barely pierced the gloom. The ticking led her to a room she hadn't noticed before. The door was ornate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when she looked at them too long. It opened without resistance, revealing a grand, dimly lit chamber dominated by an enormous grandfather clock. The clock was unlike anything Emma had ever seen. Its wooden frame was impossibly tall, stretching nearly to the ceiling, its surface carved with twisting, writhing figures. The pendulum swung with an unnatural smoothness, its motion hypnotic. The clock face, cracked and weathered, displayed no numbers, just jagged lines that seemed to rearrange themselves with each tick. Emma approached cautiously, her boots sinking slightly into the plush, faded carpet beneath her feet. The ticking grew louder as she neared, vibrating in her chest like the beat of a massive heart. Her eyes were drawn to the pendulum, its rhythmic motion mesmerizing. It swung faster than it should have, each tick accompanied by a low, resonant hum. She raised her camera, the red recording light blinking weakly as she began to film. This wasn't here before," she whispered, her voice shaky. "What is this place?" The clock's hands began to move, jerking erratically in fits and starts. They spun backward, the jagged lines on the face twisting into incomprehensible symbols. The ticking grew erratic, each sound sharper, more insistent. Emma backed away, her heart racing. Suddenly, the room shifted. The air grew colder, and the shadows along the walls deepened, stretching toward her like grasping fingers. The clock let out a deep mechanical groan, its pendulum freezing mid-swing. Emma's camera screen flickered violently, static overtaking the image. Then the whispers returned. They were different, now lower, slower, dripping with malice. They came from the clock, weaving through the room like a sinister melody. The symbols on the clock face pulsed with a dim, otherworldly light, and Emma felt a pull, as though the clock were dragging her closer. "No," she muttered, stepping back. "I'm not going near it." But her body didn't obey. Her feet moved on their own, dragging her forward even as her mind screamed in protest. She tried to fight it, to pull away, but the force was overwhelming. The pendulum began to swing again, each movement accompanied by a sound like grinding metal. As she was drawn closer, the clock face seemed to ripple like water. Emma's reflection appeared in its surface, distorted and broken, her features twisting into a grotesque grin. The reflection's eyes glowed faintly, just like the hollow man's. "Time bends for no one," a deep voice intoned, reverberating through the room. "But you are malleable." Emma's body jerked forward, her hands slamming against the surface of the clock. She screamed, struggling to pull away, but the clock held her fast. The symbols on the face began to shift, forming a spiral that spun faster and faster. Her reflection reached out, its movements fluid and wrong, and pressed its hands against hers from the other side of the glass. Pain shot through her body as the clock pulled her in. It was like being submerged in ice water, her breath stolen from her lungs. The room around her dissolved into darkness, replaced by a swirling void of light and shadow. Time itself seemed to fracture, moments overlapping and blending together. She saw herself running through the house, screaming in the red room, staring into the mirror. She saw faces she didn't recognize, twisted in agony, their mouths moving in silent pleas. The voice came again, soft and insidious. You are one with the house now. You carry its weight, its truth. Emma's vision blurred as she was thrust into the void. She landed hard on the floor of the room, the impact driving the air from her lungs. She gasped, clutching her chest, the camera still strapped to her wrist. The clock stood before her, silent now, its pendulum still. The room was unchanged, but Emma felt different, like something inside her had been taken, replaced by something far darker. She stared at the camera, its red light blinking steadily. The screen flickered, showing brief glimpses of what she had just experienced, her reflection in the clock, the twisting symbols, the fractured moments. But the final image froze her blood. It was her face, pale and hollow, her eyes glowing faintly with that same unnatural light. And then in her voice, but not her own, it whispered, "You can't escape what you've become." The clock groaned once more, its pendulum resuming its unnatural rhythm. Emma staggered to her feet, her mind racing. She had to find a way out. She had to. But as she turned toward the door, the ticking grew louder, following her, chasing her. The house wasn't finished with her yet. Emma stumbled into the hallway, the ticking of the clock pounding in her ears, each tick heavier than the last. The sound didn't fade as she moved farther from the room. It followed her, reverberating through the walls like the pulse of the house itself. Her mind was fractured, her thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. She clutched the camera tightly, its weight the only tangible anchor to reality. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, the walls warped and shifting as though alive. Doors lined either side, each slightly ajar. Faint light spilled from the cracks, casting eerie patterns on the floor. The whispers began again, soft, inviting, curling around her like a serpent. "Emma, come back, Emma." She tried to ignore them, focusing on her steps. The floorboards creaked beneath her weight, the sound unnervingly like a gasp. She approached one of the doors, her hand hesitating over the handle. Through the crack she caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow, fleeting and quick. "No," she whispered to herself, stepping back. She turned and ran, her boots pounding against the floor as the whispers grew louder. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the doors blurring together. Panic clawed at her chest as she realized the corridor wasn't just long, it was repeating. She stopped, gasping for breath, and glanced behind her. The hallway was identical, the doors the same. She turned forward again and saw something that made her heart stop. Far down the corridor, a figure stood motionless, clutching a camera. It was her same clothes, same disheveled hair, same wide, terrified eyes. The other Emma tilted her head, the movement sharp and unnatural. Then she smiled, the expression stretching too far across her face, her teeth gleaming in the dim light. "No," Emma said, shaking her head. "You're not real." The other Emma raised her camera, pointing it directly at her. The red recording light blinked once, twice, and then the whispers exploded into a cacophony of voices. The figure began to move toward her, its steps jerky, its smile never wavering. Emma turned and ran again, the hallway folding in on itself, the walls narrowing as though trying to crush her. Doors slammed shut as she passed them, the sound echoing like gunshots. The whispers grew louder, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Stay with us, you belong here." She burst through a final door, slamming it shut behind her, and found herself in a room she recognized, the dining hall. The table was bare now, the dolls gone, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. The air felt thick, heavy with something she couldn't name. "No," she whispered, backing away. "I left this room. I left it!" The clock's ticking returned, louder than ever, filling the room with its relentless rhythm. She spun around, searching for the source, but the grandfather clock was nowhere to be seen. Instead, her camera screen flickered, and the image it displayed made her blood run cold. It showed her, not in the dining hall, but back in the red room. She was standing before the wall of names, her face blank, her hand pressed against the spot where her name was written. The screen flickered again, and this time it showed her in the mirror room, her reflection smiling as it reached out toward the glass. The camera beeped. The screen froze, displaying a single message in jagged, blood-red text. Time to join. The whispers swelled, becoming a deafening roar. Emma dropped the camera, her hands flying to her ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside her head now, burrowing into her thoughts, unraveling her sanity. She turned back toward the dining table and froze. The hollow man stood at the far end, his skeletal frame impossibly tall, his hollow face tilting as though studying her. His limbs twitched unnaturally, his long fingers curling and uncurling. The air around him shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves on asphalt. "You run," he said, his voice low and resonant, shaking the very floor beneath her. "But there is no escape." "I won't stay here," Emma screamed, her voice raw. "You can't make me." The hollow man tilted his head farther, the sound of cracking bones filling the air. "You are already here. You always have been." Emma stumbled back, shaking her head. "No, that's not true." The hollow man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "This house consumes. It bends time, warps reality. There is no before, no after, only now." The walls of the dining hall began to warp, the wood twisting and groaning. The ceiling cracked, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to breathe. The table elongated, stretching endlessly into the shadows. Emma turned to run, but the doors were gone. Only solid walls remained. "Stay," the hollow man said, his voice filling the room. "Be part of the house. Be part of me." Emma fell to her knees, clutching her head as the whispers overwhelmed her. Images flashed through her mind, the red room, the mirror, the basement, the pit. Faces of those who had come before her, their mouths open in silent screams. She saw herself, walking through the house again and again, caught in an endless loop. "No," she whimpered. "I'm not part of this, I'm not." Her reflection appeared before her, grinning that unnatural smile. It reached out, its hollow eyes gleaming, and placed a cold hand on her shoulder. "You've always been here," it whispered. The hollow man loomed over her, his skeletal form blotting out the faint light. He raised a hand, and the room dissolved into darkness. Emma screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the entry hall. Her camera dangled from her wrist, the red recording light blinking steadily. Everything was quiet. The house was still. But something was different. She turned toward the front door, which now stood slightly ajar. Beyond it, moonlight spilled onto the porch. She took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. She reached for the door, her fingers brushing the handle, and stopped. A reflection stared back at her in the glass, her face, her eyes, smiling. The door slammed shut. Emma stood frozen in front of the door, her hand trembling against the cold brass handle. Her reflection in the glass didn't mimic her terror. It stared back with a hollow smile, its eyes glowing faintly with that unnatural, otherworldly light. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real. This isn't." The house groaned. The sound came from deep within its bones, a low, resonant noise that vibrated through the walls and floor. The air around her grew heavy, thick with an unseen force that pressed against her chest. She clutched her camera, the blinking red light barely illuminating the dim, suffocating darkness. The whispers returned, but they were different now, louder, stronger. They were no longer fragmented but clear, each voice distinct, overlapping in a relentless chant. "Stay, stay, stay." The walls of the entry hall began to shift, twisting and warping, as if the house were alive. Doors appeared where there had been none, only to vanish moments later. Shadows danced across the floor, stretching toward Emma like hungry fingers. She turned and ran, the camera swinging wildly on its strap. Her boots pounded against the creaking floorboards as she fled through the labyrinthine corridors. No matter where she turned, the house followed her, bending and reshaping itself, trapping her in an endless maze. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Please, just let me go." The whispers didn't respond. They only grew louder, more insistent. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, and her limbs felt heavy, as though the house itself was trying to drag her down. She burst into a room she didn't recognize. It was vast and empty, its walls stretching into darkness. At its center stood a single object, the grandfather clock. Its pendulum swung in slow, deliberate arcs, the ticking echoing like a heartbeat. The cracked face of the clock glowed faintly, the jagged lines rearranging themselves into symbols she couldn't decipher. Emma backed away, her eyes fixed on the clock. "No, not again. I'm not going near it." But the house had other plans. The floor beneath her shifted, tilting as though it were alive. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The ground began to slope, sliding her toward the clock. She scrambled for purchase, her fingers clawing at the smooth, shifting wood. But it was useless. The house was pulling her in. The whispers turned into laughter, mocking, cruel. The pendulum of the clock swung faster, the ticking accelerating into a deafening roar. The symbols on the clock face pulsed with a blinding light, and the air was filled with the sound of shattering glass. Emma screamed as she was dragged closer, her body resisting with every ounce of strength she had left. When she reached the base of the clock, the light consumed her. She woke in the red room. The crimson glow was dimmer now, the walls no longer alive with names. Instead, they were blank, smooth, and cold. Emma pushed herself to her feet, her hands trembling. The camera was gone. Her voice caught in her throat as she called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The silence was deafening. She moved to the wall where her name had once been scrawled. It was gone. All of them were. The room felt hollow, empty. She turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the house's malice, but there was nothing, just the eerie quiet. The door creaked open behind her. Emma spun around, her pulse quickening. Beyond the doorway was the entry hall, bathed in faint moonlight. The front door stood open now, revealing the porch and the dark forest beyond. For a moment she just stared, her mind racing. It was a trick. It had to be. The house wouldn't let her go. Not after everything it had done to her. But the open door beckoned, the cool night air spilling in and brushing against her skin like a whispered promise of freedom. Her legs moved before her mind could catch up. She sprinted toward the door, her heart pounding. The hallway didn't shift this time. It stayed straight, unchanging, guiding her to the exit. She reached the threshold and hesitated, her hand hovering over the frame. The air outside smelled real fresh, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Tears streamed down her face as she took her first tentative step onto the porch. The ground felt solid beneath her boots, the breeze cool against her skin. She turned back toward the house. It loomed in the darkness, its windows dark and lifeless. For the first time it looked truly empty, as though whatever had been haunting it was gone. Emma took another step away, her heart soaring. She was free. But then she heard it. The ticking, faint at first, like a distant memory. It grew louder, faster, until it filled her ears, drowning out everything else. She turned back toward the house, her blood running cold. The windows weren't empty anymore. They were filled with faces, dozens of them, hundreds. All staring at her with hollow eyes, their mouths stretched into unnatural smiles. At the center of them all, standing in the doorway, was the Hollow Man. His skeletal frame filled the threshold, his long limbs twitching unnaturally. "You can't leave," he said, his voice resonating through the forest. "You're part of the house now. You always were." Emma screamed, turning and running into the woods. The ticking followed her, relentless, merging with the sound of her own pounding heart. She didn't look back. She couldn't. But as she ran, the forest began to shift. The trees bent unnaturally, their trunks twisting like the walls of the house. The path ahead blurred, folding in on itself, leading her back to where she had started. She stopped, gasping for air, and realized she was standing on the porch again. The house stood before her, unchanged. The front door was open, waiting. Emma's reflection stared back at her from the glass, hollow-eyed and smiling. The house had her, forever.